All right. So in the last 10 and a half modules, I have talked a lot about the science behind climate change, the issues facing us, the causes of it, and what are some things we can do about it. But the fact of the matter is that we still live in a world where a lot of people do not see this as an issue. This is not a problem to them. They do not believe that this is happening. They are not concerned about it. They may even be hostile to those who are concerned about it. One of the things I would really like you to think about as we go into the end of this course, why? Why is it that there are people who are still so gung-ho against the science of climate change, who are so gung-ho against climate change in general? Well, what I wanted to do is actually just talk for just a few minutes about some of the larger numbers in this issue, and then we'll go from there. So first off, a very common thing that I hear when I talk to people about climate change is, oh, it's just a theory. It's just a theory. Well, a theory is not quite what a lot of people think of it to be. If you've ever heard somebody say, it's just a theory, or, I have a theory. Truth be told, they are using that word incorrectly. And in fact, they have abused that word. Saying climate change is just a theory is a very inaccurate statement. First off, yes, climate change is definitely a theory. Climate change is definitely a theory. However, a theory has very different meanings, and one of them is actually very, very incorrect in terms of science. I guarantee you I'm going to quiz you on this in this week's quiz. Being able to understand the problem with the societal view of the word theory. Here's what I mean. So this was taken from Merriam-Webster's dictionary. This was actually a colleague of mine who did this, and I piggybacked off of them. So a big thank you to that colleague. I actually put credits right before this. Henry Bartholomew and Eugene Cordero, thank you for this. Well, the word theory has many different definitions. The societal definition is very, very, very much different from the actual scientific definition. The societal definition of a theory is a guess, a hypothesis, a pondering, some kind of, I'm not totally sure if this is true, but here's my thought. When you hear people say, I have a theory, or they say, it's just a theory, that's what they mean. However, that is not what a theory actually means in the scientific community. That is not what a theory means in the scientific community. A theory is actually something that is tested, that is very well proven, that is actually accepted on a larger scale. It is a scientifically acceptable principle. And it is built up on a set of facts and their relations to one another. So very, very, very different from the definition of theory that many people have. Many people see it as a speculation, a guess, a hypothesis. But in reality, theories are actually tested, proven, well accepted. They've got some oomph to them. And so when saying that something is just a theory is actually inaccurately representing what a theory is. In the scientific community, theories are the bee's knees and how. They are what happens when you run something through the scientific gamut, and on the other end, it comes out looking good. That is what a theory is. That is what a theory is. So theories are very, very beefed up. Theories have a lot of backing to them. They have a lot of facts to back them up. They're very well supported and very, very well accepted. So yay, theories. Okay. Now, isn't climate change controversial? If you ask the general public, the answer seems to be yes. Climate change is very controversial. If you actually take a look, this is a poll that was asked in the late 2000s. And this was actually from 2 different polls. And the question was, does global warming come from human activities? And here's what you actually saw. What you actually saw was, one, in general, less than 50% of the public from these surveys said yes. Less than 50%. It was around 47, 48%. That's kind of scary to think about. And then you can actually look at these numbers when they're broken down by political party, when they're broken down by level of education, when they're broken down by age, gender, population density, regions. And the one thing that's actually pretty well noticed is that typically more progressive policy or more progressive people who, I guess I'll just use the term lean Democrat, people who are more liberal, tend to be more accepting of climate change. People who are college educated tend to accept it a little bit more. Women tend to accept it a little bit more than men do. And younger people tend to accept it more than older people do. And then finally, urban people tend to accept it more than rural people do. I kind of think that this sort of makes sense here in the United States. Urban areas tend to be more progressive. They tend to be a little bit more in your face in that you're seeing the consequences of it on a daily basis. Rural areas tend to be much more conservative. And as a result, they also tend to be a lot more isolated from, general society. One thing I found pretty interesting is if you actually compare college educated Republicans to those who did not have college degrees, a college education made a Republican less likely to believe that climate change is caused by human activities. But the reality is, in the climate science community, the answer is not really. In the climate science community, the answer is not really. There's actually a strong consensus on the general fundamentals. And we can actually pull this from the IPCC report as well as from some surveys. The 2014 IPCC report, so this was made up of all of the top climate scientists around the world commissioned by the United Nations, stated that human influence on the climate system is clear, and recent anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases are the highest in history. Recent climate changes have had widespread impacts on human and natural systems. So it's clear, human influence is clear. Furthermore, that same policy or that same publication, that same summary for policymakers also stated that most of the observed increase in global average temperatures is extremely likely due to the observed increase in anthropogenic greenhouse gas concentrations. There is much debate about the details. So, how much warming has happened? Which greenhouse gases are having the biggest impact? But in terms of the general fundamental concept, there is a strong consensus from climate scientists all around the world that it is happening and that we are the cause. So In the climate science community in particular, not just in the scientific community, but more specifically in the climate science community, the answer is not really. In 2009, there was actually a publication that was published. It was actually a scientific article that was published based on a 2009 poll of 10,251 Earth scientists. So this includes biologists, geologists, hydrologists, meteorologists, climatologists. This includes pretty much everybody in the scientific community, from people who weren't actively doing research and publishing their findings to people who are in the trenches right now doing research, publishing their findings, sharing them, disseminating them around the world. This is the results of that survey. The results of that survey, published by Duran and Zimmerman in 2009, actually stated that 97 to 98% of climatologists who are active publishers on climate change, 97 to 98% think that human activity is a significant contributing factor. And if you actually take a look, general publishers, people who are generally active publishing, and people who are actively doing science, who are actively doing this, the numbers were still in the mid to high 80s. You only dip below the 80s when you actually looked at non-publishers, non-climatologists, people who are in the scientific community, but they aren't actively doing research, or they're in a different field, or they're in a different part of the scientific community. Maybe they're doing more education. They're not necessarily actually working with and doing research with the data. And yet, even then, the number was close to 80%. It is worth noting that this was a different survey from the previous one that I highlighted, where it showed just south of 50% of the general public accepted the main tenets of climate change. Here, it was much closer to 55, 60%. Either way, the big answer is that the scientific community is much, much more confident that climate change is happening compared to the general public. Much, much more confident. So really, global warming is not a controversial theory. In the climate science community, the people who are actively studying this actually know what they're talking about. Not some crackpot scientist on Prager University, cough, cough, Richard Lindzen. The one guy he was probably like the one guy that said, no, climate change isn't happening. But in general, the grand bulk of the climate science community is very concerned about this. Very concerned about this. This was another publication that actually was published in 2010, so a year after the previous publication. And in this one, 97 to 98% of climate researchers support the tenets of anthropogenic climate change. So very, very, very similar numbers to the previous poll that I just showed. And so, yeah, the idea here is really that the people who are actually doing the work, who are actually in the trenches, who are actually seeing the data, who are actually looking at the evidence, 97 to 98% of them say that, yeah, this is happening and it's our fault. This is happening and it's our fault. That is insane. I mean, think about that. Think about how much disagreement there has been over what regulations best worked for COVID. When you actually think about each of the vaccines, each one of them has a certain efficacy level to it. It's 90% effective or it's 70% effective. These numbers blow those numbers out of the water. That is insane. That is insane confidence. And yet, we live in a world where, fortunately, people most people get their information from politicians, from the media. Politicians and the media have a lot of external influences to them, mostly in the form of money. Politicians in the media mostly are influenced by money. They're not influenced by scientific truth. They're influenced by who bankrolls them. And so, unfortunately, that's one of the reasons why the public perception on climate change is so weak. And that is one thing, if you get nothing else from this course, and I'm not trying to go off on a tangent here, if you get nothing else from this course, please take what you've learned here and share it with others. I am not financed by JP Morgan and Chase or by the Shell Corporation. I'm also not financed by Solyndra, they don't exist anymore, or Tesla, or big wind energy. I'm not influenced on either one of those two sides. I'm a scientist who's actually done work on a climate model, who's actually seen the results of the research that's been done, who's read many of the publications. And I can tell you right now, I would bet my whole life that climate change is real, that it is caused by human activity, and that if we don't do something about it, we are in deep, deep, deep trouble. Now, it does go to, it is worth mentioning that there is disagreement. Absolutely, there's disagreement in the scientific community. This is what that disagreement looks like. These are the 4 major government centers around the world: the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, the Matt Headley office in the United Kingdom, and the Japanese Meteorological Agency. Each one has slightly different data sets from slightly different sources, and they analyze the data slightly differently. And this is what they've all come up with. Look at those 4 results. The general trend in all 4 of those results is almost identical. The big disagreement isn't on if this is happening. The big disagreement is on how bad is it. That's the big disagreement. So yeah, the reality is we're getting warmer. And we are the reason why. We are the reason why. I think that's a good place to begin wrapping up this course. So in the next video, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to wrap up this course, and then I'm going to leave it in your hands.